It is 2014, in a village in the south of a West African country, and a man named Nda Alphonse is holding something he has never held before. It is a bar of chocolate. He has spent his working life on a small plantation, less than 12 acres. He grows a crop he inherited from his father. He wakes before the light. He walks the rows with a machete. He splits the pods open, scoops out the wet white pulp, lays the seeds on banana leaves to ferment, and turns them in the sun for a week until they darken. Then he sells them by the sack at a price he does not set. He does not know what they are for. A journalist has asked him on camera what is made from cocoa. Alphonse answers honestly. He has heard that it becomes food of some kind. He is not certain what kind. Then the wrapper comes off. He tastes it. His face changes. He says that it is sweet. And then he does the thing that the people watching would remember longer than anything else in the film. He gets on a motorbike. He carries the bar out to the young men who work his land so that they can taste it too. There are about 6 million people in this country whose lives run through that one crop. Alphonse feeds 15 of them himself, and the bar in his hand had come from somewhere else, made from beans like his, shipped, roasted, ground, sweetened, wrapped, priced, and sold in countries he has never seen. The place he lives is not called the Cocoa Coast. It was named 4 centuries ago for something else the world wanted out of it. And that older name is still printed on every map, still describing a thing that has almost entirely disappeared. This is Côte d'Ivoire. Roughly 45% of the world's cocoa comes from this one country. Not 45% of Africa's, 45% of the planet's. In a good season, 2 million tons of beans move out of these forests, down the red roads, into the 2 great ports on the Gulf of Guinea. 2/3 of it goes to Europe. The Netherlands takes the largest share, then Belgium, then Germany. It arrives as a raw agricultural commodity, and it leaves those countries as something worth many times more. Cocoa is close to 1/5 of this country's economy, and about 40% of everything it earns abroad. The global chocolate industry is worth somewhere above $100 billion a year. Côte d'Ivoire, which grows nearly half the raw material, takes about 4% of that. Those are the numbers, but numbers are not the country. The country is a rectangle of West Africa, roughly the size of Germany, running from a lagoon coast in the south to the dry savanna of the Sahel in the north. Rainforest at one end, grass and scattered trees at the other. Between them, 60 ethnic groups, more than 70 languages, and a landscape that changes character every 200 kilometers you travel, and a name that came from outside. European traders in the 15th and 16th centuries divided this coastline by what they could extract from it. Further east, the Gold Coast. Further along, the Slave Coast. Here, the Ivory Coast, for the elephant tusks that moved down to the water in such volume that the trade could name a stretch of continent. The elephants were not the point. The tusks were the point. 400 years later, the country is named for a trade that no longer exists, and it is defined by another one that its own farmers largely do not consume. Both names describe the same thing, what was taken out. But the forest that produced both of them is still here in fragments. And in the largest surviving fragment In the far southwest, something has been going on for far longer than either trade. Deep inside Thai National Park, a chimpanzee sits on the buttress root of a tree with a nut in one hand and a stone in the other. She sets the nut into a hollow worn into the wood. She lifts the stone. She brings it down at a precise angle, hard enough to split the shell and soft enough to leave the kernel whole. Panda nuts take the heavier stones. Cooler nuts take a lighter touch. She chooses accordingly. This is not instinct, it is taught. Young chimpanzees in Thai spend years watching, failing, and being corrected before they can do it well. And the technique differs from one forest to the next, which is the definition of culture. Some of the anvil stones here have been used for so many generations that archaeologists have excavated them the way they would excavate a human's site. There are perhaps 650 of these chimpanzees left in Thai. The western chimpanzee is critically endangered across its entire range, and this forest is one of its last strongholds. They are here partly because of a decision made long before any park existed. The Guro and the Ubi, the peoples of this forest, did not hunt chimpanzees. The animal was totemic. It was not food. The stone goes down, the shell opens. She eats and picks up the next one. Remember that stone. We will come back to it. 400 kilometers east of that forest, on a narrow sand spit between the Atlantic and a lagoon, there is a town of pastel buildings with their shutters hanging open. Grand Bassam. 1893. France formally declares Côte d'Ivoire a colony and names Louis-Gustave Binger, an explorer who has walked much of the interior, as its first governor. He needs a capital. He chooses this sandbar at the mouth of the Comoé River, where the Nzema people have fished for 400 years already because ships can reach it. The French build quickly and to a plan. A commercial quarter, an administrative quarter, a quarter for Europeans, with wide verandas and raised floors and gardens, a separate quarter for Africans, the governor's palace, the courthouse, the customs house, the post office, all of it going up in a few short years. 3 years later, they abandon it. Yellow fever moves through the town. The ground is swampy, the sanitation is poor, and the mosquitoes are relentless. In 1896, the administration packs up and moves inland to Bingerville. The palace is left standing with nothing to govern from it. The buildings did not fall down. That is the strange thing about Grand Bassam. The port kept working for another 40 years, shipping cocoa, coffee, timber, and palm oil out to Europe. And then Abidjan took that too, and the town simply stopped. Which is why it survived. Nothing was built over it. In 2012, UNESCO inscribed the historic town of Grand Bassam on the World Heritage List, precisely because it is the most intact colonial town left in West Africa. The old post office is now a heritage house. The governor's palace holds the National Costume Museum. The palace is still there. It is worth holding on to that image because the machinery it was built to run did not stop. It only moved. 40 kilometers west, it moved into a lagoon. Abidjan sits on the Ebrié Lagoon, a long, shallow body of brackish water running parallel to the coast, separated from the Atlantic by a sandbar. In 1898, it was a village. In 1903, it became a town at the end of a new railway. It had a railhead and it had water, but the water had nowhere to go. The sandbar sealed it off. Ocean ships could not reach the lagoon, and the surf on the open coast was too heavy to load through. So in 1950, they cut the sandbar open. The Vridi Canal is 3.2 kilometers long, 369 meters wide, and 15 meters deep. It is not an elegant piece of engineering, it is a trench through sand, held open against a coastline that constantly tries to close it. And it changed everything downstream of it, because the moment it opened, deep water vessels could sail off the Gulf of Guinea directly into a sheltered lagoon and tie up alongside a railway. Within a decade, Abidjan was the shipping and banking center of French-speaking West Africa. Today, its port moves more than 40 million tons of cargo a year and is the largest in the region. Cities grow toward money. This one grew very fast. From the water, the Plateau district looks like a small piece of somewhere else. Bank towers and ministries standing in a tight cluster on a low rise, glass catching the lagoon light, the whole skyline reflected upside down in brown water. People have called it Little Manhattan. People have called it the Little Paris of Africa. Both nicknames say more about the visitor than the city, because almost nobody lives in the plateau. Fewer than 10,000 people, it empties every evening. The city lives across the bridges. In Trikeville, where the market runs for blocks and the Maquis restaurants put plastic chairs on the pavement at dusk, and the sound system starts around 10. In Yopougon, which alone holds well over 1 million people and has produced most of what the rest of the continent thinks of as Ivorian street culture. In Adjamé, where the buses from every corner of West Africa arrive. Abidjan has grown from under 1 million people in 1975 to about 6 million now. It is still growing at roughly 2.5% a year. Almost everyone arriving is arriving from somewhere inland, and a great many of them are arriving because of what happens on the farms. The canal was cut to move cocoa. The city is what grew around the canal. And out beyond the last neighborhood, past the plantations, past the rubber and the oil palm, the forest thins into strips and then into memory. It is worth saying what was here before. At the start of the 20th century, this country carried about 16 million hectares of high canopy forest. A closed, humid, ancient block of it, part of the Upper Guinean rainforest that once ran unbroken from Ghana to Guinea-Bissau. Hold that number too, 16 million. In what is left of it, at night, an animal walks down to the water that almost nobody has ever seen alive. The pygmy hippopotamus stands about 75 centimeters at the shoulder and weighs under 300 kilograms, roughly 1/10 of its river-dwelling cousin. It is not a herd animal. It is solitary, nocturnal, and so shy that most of what science knows about its behavior comes from tracks, dung, and camera traps rather than observation. It is built for a different life than the hippo most people picture. Its eyes sit on the sides of the head rather than the top because it moves through dense understory rather than floating in open river. Its feet are less webbed and its toes spread wider for mud and forest floor. It does not hold territory by fighting for a stretch of river. It follows tunnels through the vegetation, the same paths night after night, marking them as it goes. It exists only in the Upper Guinean forests, and there are thought to be fewer than 2,500 of them left in the world. Tai holds one of the last populations with a real future. It has survived by being almost impossible to find. That has stopped working as a strategy because the thing coming for it now is not a hunter. It is a chainsaw and a seedling. Tai National Park covers about 3,300 square kilometers in the southwest corner of the country, held between the Cavalli and Sassandra rivers. It was made a forest reserve in 1926, a national park in 1972, a biosphere reserve in 1978, and a World Heritage Site in 1982. It is the largest surviving block of primary rainforest in West Africa, and it is genuinely a separate world from the rainforests most people picture. Central Africa's Great Forest and West Africa's are divided by the Dahomey Gap, a dry corridor of savanna that reaches all the way to the coast in Benin and Togo. That gap has been opening and closing for hundreds of thousands of years, and every time it opened, the western forest was cut off and left to evolve alone. The result is a biological island that is not an island. More than 1,500 plant species inside the park, over 200 of them found nowhere outside West Africa. 250 species of birds, 11 species of primate in a single forest, which is a density almost nowhere else can match. Diana monkeys and Campbell's monkeys move through the same canopy in mixed groups, and they listen to each other's alarm calls, because a leopard call from a Diana monkey means the same thing to a Campbell's monkey as it does to its own kind. Two species sharing a warning system. Below them, the forest floor holds animals almost no visitor sees. Water chevrotain, which looked like something that stopped evolving 40 million years ago and were right not to bother. 3 species of pangolin, Gentinx dica and the zebra dica, small forest antelope that exist only in this corner of the world. The zebra dica striped across the back like nothing else in Africa. And forest elephants. Smaller than savanna elephants, straighter tusked, moving in ones and twos rather than in the great matriarchal herds, opening seed pods that no other animal can open and carrying the seeds kilometers before dropping them. That last detail matters more than it sounds. A great many of the big hardwood trees in this forest depend on elephants to reproduce. Remove the elephants, and the forest does not die, but it stops replacing itself properly. It becomes a forest of the wrong trees. So there is a question sitting underneath all of this, and it is the question the whole country turns on. If a forest like this one covered 16 million hectares of Côte d'Ivoire a century ago, where did it go? 200 kilometers north of Tai, the land rises and the air changes. Man sits at around 300 meters in a bowl of green peaks, and Ivorians call it the City of 18 Mountains. To the west, the Dent de Man, the Tooth of Man, a bare rock molar standing 881 meters out of the forest. To the north, Mount Tonkui at 1,189 meters, high enough that the mornings here are cold in a country most people assume is uniformly hot. Waterfalls come off the cliffs into stands of bamboo so dense the path underneath stays dark at midday. And strung across the rivers, in a handful of villages, there are bridges made of living vines. They are woven from lianas, anchored into the root systems of trees on both banks, and they are maintained rather than built, which means nobody can give you a construction date. The knowledge of how to tie them belongs to particular families. The bridges are treated as sacred. Some of them are said to be centuries old, and since the vines grow while they carry you, there is a real sense in which the bridge is older than any part of it. This is Dan country. The Dan, also called the Yakuba, are known across West Africa for their carving and for their masks, and for one performance in particular. A stilt dancer stands 3 to 4 meters above the ground, on wooden poles bound to his legs, his entire body and face concealed by cloth and raffia. He is not a performer. Once the costume is on, He is not addressed by his own name at all, because he is understood to be a forest spirit that has come into the village. He is escorted into the open ground by handlers, and then, on stilts, 3 meters up, he dances. He drops into splits. He spins. Children are lifted up and passed to him. Most visitors read that as spectacle. In the village, it is closer to governance. The masks arrive at funerals, at initiations, at moments when a dispute needs settling and no individual can be seen to settle it. The Dan describe a world in 2 halves, the village on one side and the forest and its spirits on the other, and the masks are how the two speak. 150 kilometers east, among the Guro people around Bouaflé and Zouenula, there is another mask, and this one went around the world. The Zaouli is a small painted face, often with a bird or a second figure carved above the brow, worn by a man dressed in raffia and layered cloth with rattles at his ankles. Above the waist, he barely moves. Below the waist, his feet do something that most people watching for the first time assume is a trick of the frame rate. The rule is that within a single performance, he does not repeat a step. It takes about 7 years to learn. The dancer is always male, the mask always depicts a woman, and the name comes from a girl called Jella Lu Zaouli, the daughter of Jella, whose beauty the first mask is said to have honored. There are 7 types of Zaouli mask, each carrying its own legend. The mask itself dates only to the 1950s, which makes it young by the standards of West African carving. The rest of it is not young. The carving, the weaving, the balafon and the drums, the sung Guro proverbs the musicians layer underneath, all of that is old, and the Zaouli assembled it into one thing. The village keeps only one Zaouli dancer at a time. What happens under the mask before he walks out is not shown to anyone who has not been initiated, and it is not filmed. In 2017, UNESCO inscribed Zaouli on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. By then, it had already been on the internet for years, which is a strange kind of double life for a sacred object. Something else lives in the canopy above these forests, and almost nobody has seen it either because it stays far too high. The African giant swallowtail has a wingspan of around 20 centimeters. It is the largest butterfly on the continent, orange-brown and marked like a hawk moth, and it patrols the upper canopy of the Upper Guinean forest at speed. It is also one of the most poisonous butterflies known. The caterpillar feeds on a forest vine loaded with toxic compounds and stores them in its own tissue, carrying the poison through the pupa and into the adult. A single specimen contains enough to matter to anything that tries to eat it, and the coloring is an advertisement of that fact. The females are so rarely encountered that for a long stretch of the 20th century, collectors had almost only males. Not because the females are scarce, but because they stay in the crowns of the tallest trees and simply do not come down. It cannot survive outside closed canopy. It needs height, shade, and the specific vine its caterpillars eat. Take the tall trees out, and the butterfly does not move somewhere else. It just stops being there. Far to the north, where the forest gives out entirely and the land opens into savanna, there is a different kind of survival. 1888. Louis Gustave Binga, 5 years before he becomes governor, walks into the town of Kong. He has spent 2 years crossing the interior on foot, and he finds a place that European maps had recorded as either a mountain range or a myth. It is neither. It is a Dayula trading city, Muslim, literate, wealthy from the routes that ran gold, cola nuts and salt between the forest and the Sahara. And it has mosques built of earth. They are not large. Some of them would fit inside a modest house. They are built of sun-dried mud brick with wooden beams left protruding from the walls in rows, which serve as permanent scaffolding for the replastering that must be done after every rainy season. Vertical buttresses rise up the outer walls and are crowned with pottery jars or ostrich eggs. The minarets taper like truncated pyramids. The style came south from Djenné in the Mali Empire, where it took shape between the 12th and 14th centuries on the wealth of the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade. As it traveled south into wetter country, the buildings got lower and the buttresses got heavier, because rain does to mud what rain does to mud. At the start of the 20th century, there were several hundred of these mosques in northern Côte d'Ivoire. 20 are left standing. 8 of them at Kong, Tengrela, Kuto, Sorobango, Samatigwila, Nambira, and Kawara were inscribed together as a World Heritage Site in 2021. Kong itself did not survive intact. The city Binga walked into was destroyed in the 1890s in the wars of the Sahelian interior, and the town that stands there now is a small place with an old name. The mosque is older than the destruction, and it is still standing, and people still pray in it. That is the whole story in one building. The trade that made the town is gone. The town is mostly gone, and the thing they built with mud is what is left. The north holds more than mosques. At Kohogo, Senufo artists paint on rough cotton cloth using mud fermented in pits and dyes drawn from boiled bark, laying down figures of birds, fish, masked dancers, and hunters in dark brown on cream. At Catiola, the Mangoro women build large water jars entirely by hand, without a wheel, walking backwards around the growing pot. In the villages, the balafon, a wooden xylophone with gourd resonators, carries music that predates every border on the map. And at Bouaké, the second city, in the middle of the country, the roads from the north and the roads from the coast meet, which is the reason the middle of this country has mattered so much and costed so much. Which brings us to a building. Yamoussoukro, in the geographic center of the country, was a village of about 500 people in 1950. In 1983, it became the national capital. 6-lane boulevards were laid out with almost no traffic to carry, and on the edge of town, between 1985 and 1989, they built the largest church in the world. The Basilica of Our Lady of Peace is modeled on St. Peter's in Rome, and its dome does not merely approach St. Peter's, it exceeds it. 149 meters to the top of the cross, 272 Doric columns, some of them 31 meters tall, cast in concrete and ringing a plaza that can hold 300,000 people. Inside, room for 18,000, under 7,000 square meters of French stained glass, air conditioning under the seats. It cost somewhere around $300 million. Pope John Paul II consecrated it in 1990. The easy version of this story is that a president built himself a monument, and the easy version is repeated in nearly every article written about the place. It is also incomplete in a way worth correcting.
Félix Houphouët-Boigny
Was born in Yamoussoukro in 1905. a Baoulé chief's heir who trained as a doctor and then became a planter. In 1944, he organized the country's African cocoa and coffee farmers into a union because under French colonial rule, African planters were legally required to supply labor to European ones and were paid less for identical crops. In 1945, he was elected to the French Constituent Assembly in Paris, and in 1946, he wrote and pushed through the law that abolished forced labor across the whole of French Africa. Forced labor was not a metaphor. Men were conscripted off their own farms and sent to work other people's, under a legal code that applied only to colonial subjects. That law carries his name. Millions of people were released from a legal obligation to work for nothing. He then governed this country for 33 years, from independence in 1960 until his death in 1993. Held it stable while much of the region was not, kept France close, and presided over an economic surge so pronounced that the world called it the Ivorian miracle. The basilica was built at the very end of that, as the miracle was running out. Both things are true. The man who ended forced labor in French Africa also spent $300 million on a dome in his home village, while the economy that paid for it was already contracting. And what paid for it was cocoa. Hold that, it comes back. In the far northeast, against the border with Burkina Faso, there is a savanna so large that it is difficult to hold in the mind. Comoé National Park covers about 11,500 square kilometers. That is roughly a third of the area of Belgium inside a single protected boundary, making it the largest national park in West Africa. What makes it unusual is not the size, it is the gradient. The park runs a long way north to south, and the Comoé River runs down the middle of it, and the result is that habitats which should be hundreds of kilometers apart sit next to each other. Dry Sudanian savanna in the north, humid Guinea savanna in the south, gallery forest along every watercourse, carrying rainforest plants far north of where rainforest can otherwise grow. Rocky inselbergs standing out of the grass like islands. 620 plant species, 500 species of birds, 135 mammals. Dwarf crocodiles in the pools, chimpanzees at the northern limit of their range, in savanna, which is not where anyone expects to find them. Between 2002 and 2011, the country was administratively divided, and the north was outside government control for most of that period. The Park Service withdrew, the research station closed, cattle were driven in to graze, poaching went unchecked for the better part of a decade. In 2003, UNESCO placed Comoé on the list of World Heritage in danger. Large mammal numbers had already been falling since the 1970s. What happened after 2002 accelerated it. Then the Park Service came back. Renaud Guillon, a Belgian former commando, had worked in Comoé for more than 30 years. He is one of a small number of people who stayed connected to the place through the whole period when there was no state presence in it. When management resumed, the rebuilding was slow and specific. Rangers were retrained, mobile anti-poaching units were funded, the research station reopened. Drones went up over the grass. In 2017, the World Heritage Committee removed Comoé from the danger list. It was the first site in Africa to come off it. Surveys since then show what the conservation reports call a recovery trend. Not a recovered park, a recovering one. Poaching continues, gold miners push in from the edges, and the border with Burkina Faso is not a quiet one. But the animals are being counted again, and the counts are going up. Hold on to that as well. It becomes the last thing this film has to say. Back on the coast, at the mouth of the Bandama River, there is a town that is losing an argument with the ocean. Grand Lahou was a colonial trading post and then a fishing town, sitting on a sandspit between the river, the lagoon, and the Atlantic. Sandspits are not permanent. This one is being eaten from the seaward side, while the river shifts its channel on the other, and the old town has been surrendering buildings to the water for decades. The lighthouse, the colonial warehouses, whole streets of houses. The response has not been to defend it. The response has been to move. The population walked inland and rebuilt, and the old town is now a place people visit to look at what the sea has taken. There is something almost too neat about it. A settlement built to move goods off this coast, being removed by the coast. And the coast itself keeps going. Sassandra, the old timber port, where the river meets the sea under cliffs. Assini, where the lagoons run east toward Ghana and the surf comes in long and clean. Jacquesville, on its own strip of sand. Behind all of them, the Ebrier and the Abbey lagoons, threaded with pirogues, the fishermen working the same water their families have worked for 4 centuries, now sharing it with container traffic. To the far west, Mount Nimba rises to 1,752 meters on the border with Guinea and Liberia. It is the highest point in the country, a strict nature reserve since 1944, and home to a toad that gives birth to live young rather than laying eggs, which almost no amphibian on Earth does. It has been on the World Heritage in Danger list since 1992 because there is iron ore underneath it. Every one of these places is beautiful, and every one of them sits inside the same arithmetic. So let us do the arithmetic. 16 million hectares of high canopy forest at the start of the 20th century. Today, roughly 4 million. More than 90% of this country's original forest cover is gone. In a survey of 25 nominally protected areas covering nearly 4,000 square kilometers, researchers found that 71% of the forest inside them had been cleared or converted to plantation. Not outside the reserves, inside them. Elephants had been wiped out of 21 of those 25 areas. The single largest driver, by a wide margin, is cocoa. And the mechanism is worth understanding because it is not simple greed and it is not simple carelessness. It is a soil problem. Cacao is a forest understory tree. It evolved in the shade of the Amazon basin. When you clear primary forest and plant cacao into the ground underneath, the trees grow extremely well because they are sitting in centuries of accumulated forest soil. Farmers call it the forest rent. Yields are high for roughly 20 to 30 years. Then, the rent runs out. The soil thins, the old trees stop producing, disease moves in, and the return per hectare falls. At that point, the farmer has 2 options. Invest heavily in fertilizer, replanting and shade trees on land he may not hold clear title to, or move to the next piece of forest and start again. For a century, moving has been cheaper. That is how a country loses 90% of its forest without anyone deciding to. There is one more thing living in that forest floor, and the entire chocolate industry rests on it. The cacao flower is tiny, roughly the size of a pencil eraser, and it grows directly out of the trunk and the older branches rather than the twigs. It is hooded, complicated, and it faces downward. It cannot pollinate itself. It is too small and too convoluted for a bee to enter. The only creature that can get inside it is a midge, Forcipermia, a biting midge 1 to 3 millimeters long from the same family as the no-see-ums that pass through window screens. It works at dawn and at dusk, in the half hour when the flowers open. Pollen grains catch on the hairs of its thorax. It does not fly far, and it does not breed in the cacao tree. It breeds in the wet, shaded, rotting material on the forest floor. Leaf litter, split pod husks, decaying wood. It needs humidity and it needs shade. Which means that a full sun plantation, cleared of every other tree and swept clean between the rows, removes exactly the habitat that its own crop's only pollinator requires. Under intact shade, the midges are abundant. In open monoculture, pollination rates have been measured as low as a fraction of 1% of flowers. The tree flowers by the thousand and sets almost nothing. Half the world's chocolate depends on an insect smaller than a grain of rice that will not live in the conditions we grow chocolate in. Almost nobody who eats it has ever heard of it. And Alphonse, who has grown the crop his whole life, would not have been told either. Almost nobody who eats it has ever heard of it. And Alphonse, who has grown the crop his whole life, would not have been told either. The cocoa belt is not one place. It is a band across the south and southwest of the country, 400 or 500 kilometers wide, running through Divo and Gagnoa and Daloa, and down through Subre toward the sea. There is no plantation to photograph. There is no company estate. Roughly 800,000 small holdings, most of them under 12 acres, most of them worked by a family, most of them reached by a red laterite track that turns to grease in the rains. The main harvest runs from October to March. A second, smaller one comes in April. A cacao tree flowers on its trunk, thousands of blossoms at a time, and sets fruit on perhaps 1 in 100 of them. The pods that survive hang directly off the bark like something attached from outside. They ripen to yellow and orange and deep red, and they are cut down with a blade on a pole, because pulling them damages the cushion the next flowers will grow from. Then the pod is opened, not cut through, struck on the side once with the flat of a blade or against a stone, hard enough to split the husk and soft enough to leave what is inside whole. Which is precisely what a chimpanzee does with a panda nut, 400 kilometers west, in the last of the forest. Inside the pod are 30 to 50 seeds in white pulp. They are laid in heaps on banana leaves and covered, and for about a week they ferment. The pulp liquefies and runs off. The temperature inside the heap climbs past 45 degrees. The seeds die, and as they die, the chemical precursors of every flavor that will later be called chocolate are formed. Nothing about this can be skipped. A bean that has not fermented properly cannot be made into chocolate at any later stage by anyone. Then, the beans go onto raised mats to dry in the sun for another week, turned by hand, covered when it rains. Everything that makes chocolate taste like chocolate happens on that farm. Everything that makes chocolate expensive happens somewhere else. The sacks go out by pickup to a buyer, and from the buyer to a cooperative warehouse, and from the warehouse in trucks to the coast. San Pedro is the endpoint, a port built into the southwest coast at the end of the 1960s, purpose-designed for one job, and now the largest cocoa export terminal in the world. Ships load there for Amsterdam and Antwerp and Hamburg. In a strong year, more than 1.5 million tons will have passed through the country's ports by the middle of May alone. Grand Bassam's governor's palace is still standing 40 kilometers east of Abidjan, with nobody in it. The wharf it served is gone. The trade it was built to administer is not gone. It simply moved down the coast and got very much larger. Now the money. The farm gate price is fixed by the state each season. In an average year, an Ivorian cocoa farmer earns on the order of 78 cents a day. A kilogram of premium European chocolate on a shelf in Brussels costs about what that farmer earns in 45 days. The country that grows nearly half of the world's cocoa receives about 4% of what the world pays for chocolate. In 2019, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which together supply around 2/3 of the global crop, acted jointly for the first time. They imposed a premium of $400 per ton on every export contract and called it the living income differential. The intention was to move farm incomes 20 to 30% closer to a living wage. Some buyers absorbed it, others reduced the quality premiums they had previously paid by roughly the same amount, so that the price on the invoice went up and the money reaching the farm did not. And underneath the price sits the thing nobody in the industry disputes. Children work in these fields, not as an aberration in a few places, but across the sector, and the reason is not culture and it is not indifference. It is that a household earning 78 cents a day cannot hire adult labor and cannot always afford school fees, and the pods still have to come down. The industry's own monitoring systems covered about 347,000 households by the end of 2024. Where those systems reached, 44% of the children found working were no longer working after 2 follow-up visits. That is the number. It is better than it was. It is not close to zero. Let that sit. And the ground itself is now working against the arrangement. The old trees are past their best years. Swollen shoot, a virus carried by mealybugs, has spread through the belt, and there is no treatment for it. The only response is to cut out infected trees and replant, which costs a farmer 3 or 4 years of income from that land. Rainfall has become erratic. 2023 and 2024 brought harvests so poor that world cocoa prices reached the highest level in modern record, briefly passing $10 a kilogram. Prices that high did not settle the argument. They ended it in a different way. The 2025 and 2026 season came in larger, demand fell back, and by early 2026, the price had crashed again. Farmers who had finally been able to buy fertilizer found the market underneath them gone. So the last question is whether any of it can change. 2 things are moving. The first is that the beans are increasingly not leaving raw. In 2024, about 777,000 tons, roughly 44% of the harvest, were ground and processed inside Côte d'Ivoire rather than shipped as raw commodity. Installed capacity now exceeds 1 million tons. Every ton processed here rather than abroad adds somewhere between $900 and $1,200 of value that stays in the country. The second is that Europe has stopped accepting the paperwork. Under new European rules, cocoa entering the European Union has to be proven not to come from land deforested after the end of 2020, which means every sack must be traceable to the plot it grew on. For the first time, the incentive runs the other way. A farm that cleared forest is worth less than a farm that did not. Shade trees, which the midges need, which the soil needs, which the crop's own yield eventually needs, are no longer a sentimental idea. They are a condition of sale. None of that is a solution. Traceability is expensive, and the smallest farmers are the least equipped to prove anything. The forest that has already gone is not coming back inside a human lifetime. But it is the first time in 130 years that the thing being counted at the port is not only the weight. Half the world's chocolate grows here, in the leaf litter of 800,000 small holdings, under trees that came from the Amazon, pollinated by an insect nobody can see, harvested by hand, opened with a stone, fermented on banana leaves, dried on the ground, and carried away. And in 2014, a man who had done all of that for 30 years put a piece of it in his mouth for the first time, and got on a motorbike to share it. One question has been waiting since the first minute of this film: the name. The African forest elephant is not a smaller version of the savanna elephant. It is a separate species, split from its cousin somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million years ago. It stands under 2.5 meters. Its ears are oval rather than fanned, and its tusks grow straight down and point slightly backward so that it can move through dense understory without catching them. Those straight tusks are harder and denser than savanna ivory. That is precisely why they were wanted. Before the 17th century, this coastline probably carried one of the largest elephant populations in West Africa. It carried enough that European merchants named the entire stretch of continent after the product. By the 1980s, surveys were describing 20 isolated forest elephant populations. By the early 1990s, the total across the country, forest and savanna together, was estimated in the hundreds. In the survey of 25 protected areas, elephants were gone from 21 of them. The ivory trade did not finish them. The forest clearance did. An elephant confined to a fragment of woodland surrounded by farmland runs out of food, walks into the crops, and becomes a problem to be solved. The country is named after an animal it has almost none of. That is not irony, it is a receipt. But in Comoé, in the north, where the state was absent for the better part of a decade and the poaching went unanswered, the rangers went back in, and the counting started again. 3 herds, around 200 animals. 200 elephants is not a recovery, it is a remnant. But it is a remnant that is being watched in a park that came off the world's endangered list in 2017, the first anywhere in Africa to manage it. In 2025 alone, more than 61,000 hectares of degraded land across the country were put under restoration, and the stated national target is to take forest cover back from about 10% to 20%. Meanwhile, the mosque at Kong still stands and is still replastered every year by hand. The stilt dancer at Godufuma still comes out of the trees. The Zaouli dancer at Zugunefla still does not repeat a step. The chimpanzee in Tai still sets the stone down on the anvil and picks up the next nut. For 400 years, the world has described this place by what it could carry away from it. Ivory, then timber, then coffee, then cocoa. Every name it has been given is a name for an export. None of those names ever mention the 18 mountains, or the bridges made of living vine, or the 8 earthen mosques, or the toad on Mount Nimba that gives birth to living young, or the insect that makes chocolate possible, or the 200 elephants being counted, one at a time, in the long grass in the north. Those things were never on the manifest. They are still here. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you would like to keep traveling, subscribe, and we will meet at the next